up for that. So I'm gonna and oh yeah, thanks for recording this, Nate. So I'm gonna start off by sharing my screen, if I'm able to do that. I'm sure I can. Okay, great. Can everybody, Nate, can you see my screen?
Your screen looks good, Charles.
Okay, great. So I just want to start off by thanking everyone. I want to thank everyone that has joined today. In particular, as Rupa just said, the other members of the Catalyst team, Nate, Jenny, and Rupa, but as well the other members of Innovation Ventures that have joined, both the case managers, other people in the tech transfer, entrepreneurship, and industry departments. And I also want to thank the PIs and the members of the Catalyst Award teams that have joined. And finally, I almost want to say most importantly, but I'm not going to say that. I want to thank all the interns that have signed up and are currently on the call. And I guess the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to start now with the plan tonight. Okay, so the plan tonight is I'm just going to start off. I'm going to give a quick snapshot of the internship workshop series. Tonight's the first of 3. And then I'm going to give an introduction to the Catalyst program and then talk about the target product profile and its role in product development. Give a few details on the summer internship program. And then I'm going to turn it over to Geeta Rao. I'll introduce her at the time, and then turn it over to Erica Pascal, introduce her at the time. And then we're going to finish, hopefully, with all of us going to the breakouts, the Zoom breakout sessions corresponding to your project. And so each of these 4 sessions are hopefully going to take about 20 minutes each. And so I better move ahead. And so with respect to tonight, I already said I'm going to talk about the TPP and what it's comprised of. And then Geeta is going to talk about the key aspects of the TPP from her experience. And then Erica Pascal is going to talk about the importance of intellectual property and garnering patents and trademarks and copyrights and the like, especially in the context of this summer's TPP process. And then next month, Ken Fang and Rupa are going to talk about, again, the TPP and also project management tools. And then in August, we have both Nate and Jenny talking about entrepreneurship in general, as well as entrepreneurship and innovation. And I just noticed something that if you have questions, because one just came into the chat, maybe it's a question, maybe it's not. I didn't know I could see them. So you can type the question in the chat, or you can raise your hand. But I'm not going to be able to monitor that. So Nate's going to monitor that, and he's going to interrupt me if it's appropriate to interrupt me. Okay, I'm going to start off talking about the Catalyst program. And so when you think about research and development, there's a phase in between called translation. It's also referred to as the valley of death, which is an awful term, but it's really the product development phase in between the basic discoveries and in between the commercial development. And it's interesting that this so-called valley of death really is a funding sort of gap in the context of product development. And the role of academia, the role of universities in addressing the translational challenge is a really sort of hot area. These are just some mastheads of papers that touch on this. And the Catalyst program was created to facilitate advancement along the so-called translational path. You can see with that one arrow that the Catalyst program is 12 years old now. And as you can see in the text that I put the box around, the concept's unusual, that there's some financial support, but the real prize, as it's written, was the mentorship and the partnership and the consulting and the advice of our volunteer industry advisors, which are the absolute key to the Catalyst program. And so the snapshot, I don't think I have to remind everybody that the University of California, San Francisco is only focused on healthcare. So there's a medical school, a pharmacy school, a dental school, a nursing school. And so all the product tracks that we support are in the area of healthcare, and specifically new therapeutics, new diagnostic tests, new medical devices, so-called digital health solutions, and platforms and tools. And you look below there, we have over 80 active industry advisors that provide the project's mentorship. And we also have seed funding. And very, very importantly, we have the internship program that supports the projects, and as well, the projects, hopefully impact the interns in terms of their own career journeys. Now, within these 5 tracks of drugs and tests and devices and digital, there are the subcategories that if you're not familiar with, you will get familiar with. I'm not going to touch on all these, but I think you know that if you look at the top left and you think about therapeutics, sometimes they're pills that you swallow, sometimes they're injections that you take when they're a biologic medicine. And now we've got cell therapy and gene therapy, and obviously vaccines and the like. So even within an individual track, there's a lot of diversity. And I know you all know this, there's also products that go across individual tracks. And it was just pointed out to me yesterday that nowadays, most all products cross more than one of these tracks. I said the Catalyst program is 12 years old. And since its inception, there have been 260 projects supported. They've been...
Can you please mute if you're not the one speaking?
Monica's going to get me in.
Thanks, Rupa. And those 250 projects have been awarded a little over $10 million in funding, but they've led to over $500 million of subsequent funding on the same projects. And these projects have also been issued over 40 patents, and a number of startup companies have either been based on these projects or in-license these projects for their start. And Rupa already mentioned this. The Catalyst team is Rupa, the Senior Associate Director, who's got a PhD in biochemical engineering and also at Caltech, and also went to the IIT. Jenny's got a PhD in biology from Berkeley, and who went to Duke before then. And Nate's got a master's in health administration from Marquette. He was at LMU before. And I'm going to mention this later, hopefully. Rupa, in addition to working in Catalyst, she also runs the Innovation Ventures Philanthropy Fund that I'm hopefully going to mention. And Nate and Jenny both run the UCSF Launchpad, which is affiliated with the Blackstone Launchpad. I mentioned the advisors. Our industry advisors are just key. Our advisors cover, and actually 2 of them are talking right after me, both Geeta and, Geeta and Erica are both very, very active industry advisors. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of individual topics that we have experts in: medicinal chemistry and drug formulation, developing prototypes, and reimbursement. Again, Catalyst is this facilitating hub. And when the projects come into Catalyst, hopefully the term they use is exit successfully, either to starting a company or maybe another accelerator program or an incubator program, or that type of thing that's there on the right. I already sort of alluded to this, but when projects develop from inception to actually the marketplace and benefiting patients, they all tend to go down a similar little path. And I've got 5 of these sort of pipelines that all basically look the same. All 5 of these basically look the same. And I'm not going to go over all these. I'm just going to touch on the one that I'm sort of familiar with, because before I got to UCSF, I spent 30 years doing drug discovery and San Francisco Bay Area startup companies. And the way the drug discovery works is here from the left to the right, or from the soup to the nuts, where you identify the targets, you identify chemical matter that can modulate them, you advance them to drug candidates, and then you initiate clinical studies, and hopefully you get FDA approval. And each of these fundamental stages or steps each have their own sort of activities and inflection points. And the thing that you'll come to realize by the end of the day is all the catalyst projects, all 15 catalyst projects are somewhere in this spectrum. They're not all at the far left, they're not all in the middle, they're not at the right. And so each catalyst project is somewhere along the spectrum at the moment. And what we're all doing this summer is we're helping them advance toward the right. We're helping them take that next step, whether it's a drug, a diagnostic test, a medical device, a digital health solution, or a platform or a tool. All the catalyst projects, and these are the things that the applicants had to address, is these 6 things. What is the unmet need? How do you think you're going to fix it? How feasible is it you're going to get to the finish line? Is there an opportunity to get patents or trademarks or copyrights? And will the eventual entity, whether it's a big pharmaceutical company or a big medical device company or a little startup, will they be able to attract capital, and will they be able to make a profit eventually? So this year we had 42 applications that went through review. The advisors narrowed these down to 19 finalists, and 15 of the projects were awarded. And this is a list of the 15 projects that we're all working on this summer. I'm shifting gears now to the actual target product profile. Like, what is a TPP? And I'm just going to sort of touch on the things that are like underlined and well, I'm just going to touch on all 6 of these points. So the first bullet, it's really a description of what does this product really need to, look like or be for it to be a success. And the second point is really, really interesting, is that you really want to think about what will it look like at the very, very end. And so we're really sort of starting at the beginning with having the end in mind, which is sort of, it's a little bit sort of like anti-scientific. Normally in science, you're figuring out where you are and what comes next, and then what comes after that, and you're meandering sometimes, you're pivoting. You might be on a path and then you discover something that's even more important, so you pivot. When it comes to product development, you kind of want to put on what the race blinders to keep your eye on the finish line. This next thing is important, this third bullet, because it's not just the science, it's not just the medicine, it's also the engineering, the clinical, the market, the commercialization, the intellectual property, the legal aspects. And so that's why you're going to see that the target product profile captures the science, the engineering, the law, the business, and the like. Fourth bullet's sort of important. It helps guide decisions. Like, it helps guide go, no go decisions. Like, I think a lot of you have heard that, stopping a project, deciding that it's futile, it's not going to be a success, is super, super, super important. Our natural tendencies are just to continue. But in business and in commerce and in product development, you have to know when to stop, because it is a zero-sum game. The investment in this project is really at the expense of investment in another project. And if you have another project that's more likely to succeed, the sooner you know that you should shift to that other project, the better. And so the second to the last as you'll see in terms of these TPPs, this is the key thing. These TPPs identify both the ideal attribute for a given product, as well as the minimal, as well as, well, what's the minimum that we can achieve to still be a success? And then finally, these TPPs are not carved in stone. They're dynamic documents and they need to be reviewed. In fact, for 2 of the projects this summer, I think it's 2. These are projects that are not repeats, what do we call them? They're catalyst projects for a second time. They've already done TPPs in the past. And so they're refining their TPPs this summer. And so depending upon who, let's say, the audience is or the stakeholders are, TPPs have different purposes. That in industry where I come from, they're what I've been referring to. They're like planning tools that help guide projects and help you make decisions taking them forward. At the FDA, they can serve as an instrument for communication. To the extent that the FDA uses these as a form of communication varies. I'm just pointing that out. It might come up in Geeta's talk. And then the World Health Organization uses them, especially in the context of diseases in lower income countries, like diseases like malaria and tuberculosis and the like, to say, this is what we at the WHO wants a malaria drug to look like. You know, it can't be $50 a day. It has to be 50 cents a day. You know what I mean? So the WHO uses them for sort of a different context. In fact, all 3 of these entities, the private companies, the regulatory agencies, and the international health funding agencies, use them differently, but the actual target product profile is sort of analogous or similar. This is an example of what a pharmaceutical, a drug discovery target product profile contains. These 18 fields, and actually they're always in the same order. And the reason they're always in the same order is they correspond to when you go to the pharmacy and you get your prescription and you open that little cardboard box and you see that super thin paper that you can almost, look through if you're holding it against the sun. That thin paper, not surprisingly, is called the package insert. It's also called the product label. They're actually synonyms. The product label and the package insert are the exact same thing. And when you see an ad on the television for a drug and they play that loud music to distract you and they talk about the side effects, those are coming specifically from the package insert, specifically from the product label. And so, like I said before, when a company uses a target product profile for their drug, when they tend to do it is right when they've decided to nominate the drug candidate for clinical development, for clinical trials, because that's when it gets super, super expensive. And they want to know exactly what their product candidate needs to achieve in order for it to be a commercial success. And so in a big pharmaceutical company, the target product profile is a prophetic or a hopeful view of what that thin paper will read maybe 6 years or 4 years or 10 years before there's any thin paper. And so they put together this document to guide the development process. Okay, so that's that. Now, I don't want to confuse you because this can be confusing, but if you look at the subtitle, the subtitle at the top, it says the Catalyst project teams will be developing more of a TCP. So if you look at the bottom, we're really in the discovery and translational phase, right? And so we're really developing target candidate profiles. We're really developing something such that a big molecular diagnostics company or a big medical device company or a big pharmaceutical company will come to UCSF and say, hey, that project of yours, we want it. We want to license it from you. We're willing to spend all this money. And UCSF and the professor will say, oh my goodness, that's fantastic. And they'll license the candidate to the big company. Or they'll say, you know what, thank you very, very much, but we want to start a startup company about this. We've got venture capitalists that are interested in funding our startup. And so these target candidate profiles will be the documents that convince, or I'm not saying, I got to rephrase that. They're not the documents that convince, but they can be a document that helps to convince either the pharmaceutical company or the medical device company or the venture capitalist, hey, this has promise. We know what we have to do to get to the finish line. And I'm not going to say more than that, but if you're interested in this, we can talk about it more. And so these are the types of fields that you're going to be working on this summer. These are the fields of the target candidate profile. So on the left are the fields for drug projects. On the right are the fields for medical device projects. And then for the other three types of TPPs, diagnostics, digital platforms, they're similar, they're analogous. And all five of these templates, because we have templates for all five, you can look at and check out. And then if somebody's thinking on the call here, well, wait a minute, he said that a lot of projects cross more than one track and some even cross three. Well, then those target product profiles are sort of they're custom, they're chimeric, and they borrow from the different templates. And so basically all 15 templates are going to be a little bit custom, but they start from a basic thing. Now, I got to look at my clock really. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to go over this. You know what? I'm going to speed ahead right now. This is just one example of how the market opportunity is presented. And it's interesting. It's called Sam's, wait, I can't even say it. Tam Sam Som. Some of you might already, especially all the business students that are on the call, might already be familiar with this. They can be sort of boggling to me. I'm a scientist, but they're really, when they're done right, they're really liberating. And I had a couple of examples that Rupa put together for me on the difference between a tamasam and a SOM for a bone drug, for a medical device, and for an asthma, but I'm not going to go over this. I am getting to the end. The thing that's cool in terms of all your folks working on these target product profiles is we have a number of databases that we've collected of information that you can use around the competitive landscape, around what's in pharma company pipelines, around stuff like that. Oh, I see there's a list on the right. So you've already read through these while I'm trying to remember them. But, omics, databases of systems biology, treatment guidelines, and the like. And I think we've got 50 of them now, and we'll give you this Excel spreadsheet, and some of them are really useful, some of them are okay. We also have access to a very powerful database called Global Data. It tends to focus just on pharmaceuticals and medical devices, but also captures a little bit in digital and diagnostics. This is what Global Data does. We're going to have hopefully, actually not hopefully, we're going to have training from the Global Data representative. And so that'll be good. This is what we're doing this summer. We're starting with this workshop. I'm not going to go over this very much. The other thing I want to point out is that the four people from Catalyst, Jenny, Nate, Rupa, and I, each of us staffers are going to shepherd or mentor or what, that's not the right, yeah, we're going to shepherd a set of projects. These are the three Jenny's going to shepherd. These are the six that Rupa's going to shepherd. And again, two of Rupa's already have TPPs, but Rupa's got more than the rest of us. These are the three that Nate is gonna shepherd, and these are the three that I am gonna shepherd. We're actually part of an ecosystem. I'm not gonna really go over this. I kind of wanted to, but it's cool. One of these members of our ecosystem is the Invent Fund, which actually is really cool. They can get up to 20 times more funding. They can get up to like $1 million, actually up to 2 million, even though none have gotten 2 million. It turns out that 10, it's not the first 185. That's a typo. It's the 10 of the first 18. That's pretty funny. That's my fault. Have been catalyst projects. I already mentioned that Nate and Jenny run the Launchpad, which is focused entirely on student entrepreneurship. It's totally cool. Some of you would be interested in that. Entrepreneurship, I know Stephanie Maris is on the call. Stephanie Maris runs this course. You can see at the bottom arrow. This fall, it's starting again. You can check into this. And then Jenny, the last thing I want to say, and we're hoping that all these projects, well, we'll see what happens. We're hoping that all the projects will go through I-Corps this year. You'll see that you can read this quickly on the right, what the Bay Area I-Corps is. Oh, the next thing I have to say is confidentiality is super important. And in fact, when we have these breakout sessions this afternoon, they're not going to be under confidentiality because some of the interns haven't signed the CDAs. So I just want to point out this entire program is under confidentiality, which is super, super important. It's okay to tell your parents or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or anybody else that you're an intern and you're working on this project in asthma, but you really have to be really, really careful about saying anything that could be confidential, and especially on things like LinkedIn or anything like, well, no, not especially, but things like social professional media and the like. And so I just want to emphasize this, that you can say what you're working on and what the project's focused on, and the current titles of our projects are non-confidential, but you're going to be learning things that are confidential. And some of these projects are in extremely competitive situations where there's other universities, other people doing very similar things. And so again, I'm done. I went a little over. I'm going to be turning it over to Geeta right now. And I just want to mention that my friend Geeta was an undergrad at the IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology in India, as was Rupa. They actually went to different IITs. Geeta went to Madras and Rupa went to Bombay. And then Geeta came to America and got a PhD. She actually got a master's first and got a PhD from MIT, and got a master's in business from Stanford, and then spent the first half of her career as both a company founder and a CEO. And for the last, I think, almost 20 years, she's led her own sort of company focused on supporting translation with, I think, an emphasis in medical devices and digital health. And we're really happy to have Geeta. Let me just ask Nate really fast. Hey, Nate, were there any questions for me that were pressing, or can I hand it over to Geeta right now?
I say hand it over to Geeta just based on how much time we have right now.
Great. Thanks, Geeta. You take it over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Charles, for that lovely introduction. I hope I live up to it. So Charles asked me to cover a couple of the elements of the TPP. And since you gave me permission to just focus on a couple of areas, I'm going to take your advice on that, Charles, and dive in a little bit. I'll have some broader remarks too, but I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Hopefully, let me know if you can see my screen. Let me know as soon as you can see my screen. Should just see a
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay,
We can
terrific.
see.
Okay, so I'll just make a few remarks on the sort of the broad nature of what the TPP is or could be and how to go about it. And then I'll focus on a couple of topics that are dear to my heart, which is the regulatory aspects of things. Okay, so just make sure that I am actually in the right application. Oh, come on, don't do this to me. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to pick up where where Charles left off, which was that there are the elements of the target profile, and across the top you can see that these are the different classifications of the tools of the tracks, I guess. And what you really see is that they kind of bleed over into each other. So a therapeutic, and in fact, every single instance in this cohort of BioTool was actually attached to a therapeutic. I don't think there was a single, the list you sent me, Charles, it wasn't a single one that was stood by itself. And then some of these devices, these BioTools can be diagnostic, or they can be their own, product that's diagnostic. And you can accomplish diagnostics either with a biomarker or a tissue, an in vitro diagnostic, or you can accomplish it with a digital product, a digital diagnostic, where the biomarker is a digital biomarker. And that leads us to digital health. And then we have the more traditional medical devices, which are typically hardware or have some hardware elements. So what I wanted to look at is, if you looked at the list that Charles laid out, the elements of the TPP are common across the top and the bottom. All of them, you want to give a little explanation of what the product is, maybe the technology, really focus on what is the unmet clinical need, figure out who else is trying to solve or works around that clinical need, whether it's unmet or partially met or not so well met, and then figure out what your product or this product is going to translate into. What is the target for this product? And I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about indications, because that's a really critical topic to think about. And then what comes out of it after you've analyzed everything in the middle is, at the end of the day, you have some intellectual property opportunity. You have some regulatory pathway, which is tied very closely to the indication for use. You have the reimbursement and the market opportunity. And then in between, what you have are a bunch of different elements that vary from product type to product type. But what's interesting about all these elements is, at the end of the day, they are all drivers of risk. And the key thing you need to understand of translational risk or development risk, and the key thing to understand is which of these are really important for your product. So this checklist that you have been, the conventional wisdom is these are really important, so make sure you cover them. But in addition, there may be other drivers of risk. That's kind of what the overall TPP exercise is to figure out at the end of this, what you're going to start with, what's your big picture, what you're going to end up with, and what are the key things you need to know in order to get there. Okay, so with that in mind, finding the optimal TPP is a bit of a search process, okay? So the first, you have the technology platform, and it can vary in complexity from something relatively simple to something pretty complicated, kind of schematically represented by the shading, okay? Then you overlay on it the market opportunity, and it stands to reason that, the more complicated the technology, the more likely you have a better market opportunity, but not always. So you might overcomplicate your technology without having a strong market opportunity. Then you can overlay on it this notion of what's your reimbursement space looking like? And then finally, and this is just a schematic, finally you're looking at, what IP can come out of your technology platform. So this is where we want to get to. You want to say, okay, net, where do we net out with this particular technology once you're finished or you're ending the translation, or maybe even, summarizing the translational work, and the TPP is capturing all of that information. Okay, so now once you look at this, the question is, what is your search? Apologize for the cheap animation, but what is your search process? Like, how are you going to end up with the right product? What is the right product? And the first thing I'll tell you is that there's no one right product. It's often the space, and which is why Charles was talking about the candidate product, as opposed to the product profile. That you might have a candidate profile. And then particularly in digital health and medical devices, since you have a lot of room for extension and line extensions and all the all kinds of technology platforms have opportunity to create multiple products and go to market with multiple products. Often it's about a roadmap. It's not about one product, but a roadmap. So I would encourage you to think about the TPP as a starting point, but also really talk around what the roadmap might be. Okay. So the key role of regulation, which is the one I'm going to focus on, is because pretty much everything in life sciences is regulated. It's a regulated industry from top to bottom by multiple organizations, including the FDA, the FTC, the FCC, CMS, all kinds of people regulated. But I'm just going to focus on FDA just as a shorthand. All drugs and biologics, tissues, vaccines, medications of all sorts are regulated. And so are all devices, everything from MRI machines to implantable devices to Band-Aids are regulated. So pretty much the FDA and its counterparts in the other parts of the world govern the lives of that key, what I call a key governor. We really need to know where they're thinking when you think about your product profile. So the thing to think about is that when you look at if let's say we're just looking at the technology platform and the market opportunity, and you're trying to find the optimal space, when you overlay regulatory burden on it, it stands to reason that as the regulatory burden, as the technology is simpler, you may have less market opportunity, maybe you have lower clinical impact. Here's just an example of a two-dimensional graph of low to high clinical impact and a low to high regulatory burden that you can overlay on the technology platform. Okay. And out of this will come one or more indications for use. Okay, so I want to really talk about the indication for use here. So the formal definition of a medical device is an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, blah, 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 which means, in other words, just about anything which is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease, other conditions, cure, mitigation, treatment, blah, blah, blah. That does anything at all. And then there are some exceptions that accomplishes that's not a medication, basically, okay? And then the one key thing to keep in mind for those of you in digital health is that the agency does not regulate the practice of medicine. So when you get to digital health, particularly a couple of the cohort companies for this year, may actually fall into the practice of medicine and may actually be exempt from FDA regulations. So be sure you track that. And the interns that are in that particular cohort, make sure you don't forget that, yes, everything is regulated, but there are things that are on the edge of regulation, and FDA may not be the governing regulator. Okay. And then similarly, so the keyword is intended for use. Okay. It's not what the product is, but what it's intended to do that the FDA regulates. Similarly, there's a definition for drug, which is an article intended for use in diagnosis, cure, etc. Any article other than food intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So keywords, intended use. And then definition of cosmetic, and I don't think we have any cosmetics in this cohort, but rub, poured, sprinkled, sprayed, etc. And keywords intended to be. So again, what the FDA regulates is what you're intending. Okay, what's the difference? Oh, one other last thing I want to talk about. If you look at digital health, software device definition used by the FDA is there's a definition of software as a medical device, which is a software that meets the definition of a medical device, and we've already talked about the definition, or software that's in a medical device, which meets the definition of device and is used to control some hardware part of the device. Okay, so it's either way a software. So software as a medical device is digital health. Software that is not part of a hardware device is also a part of a medical device. So all the definitions bleed over into each other. But the keywords again are intended use, or intended to be used. Now, just a word on the term. Intended use is actually an old traditional term that the FDA and other jurisdictions, the EU uses intended purpose. These days, it's an old term. We don't actually use it. We use it colloquially, but FDA doesn't use it very much anymore, except in legacy documentation. It does, instead we use the term indications or indications for use, which explains when a product is indicated for its use. And it's an amalgamation of the term indications that was used for medications and drugs and biologics, and the intended use the two have now been coordinated, coalesced into a single term, which is indications for use. So intended, whenever we say intended use, think indications for use. Okay, so here's the biggest myth. The FDA does not directly regulate the technology, okay? It regulates the intended use, AKA indication for use. So, and I usually have a little show and tell. Oh, let me see if I might have it here with me. Oh, I do. So can you see me? I'm holding up something in my hand. So if anyone can volunteer, what is this? It's a piece of bamboo, you know,
Depressor.
could be. Okay, I'll go with that. So this is the definition of intended use, which is, there's no definition of intended use at the FDA, so it's a standards definition. It's the use for which a product, process, or service, could be services, biotools, is intended, which according to the specifications, instructions, and information provided by the manufacturer. So it is not that one line which is in your TPP. It is all of the 23 pages that Charles showed you the example collectively define what the intended use is. Okay, so that if you look at a piece of bamboo, it could be anything, you know. It could be a craft supply, depending on what it's intended to be used for. It could be a food product if it's used as a popsicle stick, or as Rupa jumped to the medical device definition, it's a tongue depressor. And each of these gets regulated differently. And the key takeaway here is that the technology that's being developed before it gets translated is just a piece of bamboo and you know how to cut it. But if you can package it in a sterile package, it can become a medical device. If you can figure out a way to process in the manufacturing process, sterilize and use it, that can be a food product, okay? And if it could just be a health and wellness, mental health product for crafts, okay? So there are many different ways the same technology platform can be translated. So the intended use is one way you get to define it, or indications for use is one way you get to put a thumbtack or a marker in, or a pin in that map and say, that's where this intended use is, okay? It's a very key point that I wanted you to all understand. So, and then similarly with health IT, there is admin functionality, health management functionality, and then medical device functionality. So a couple of the cohort companies we have could simply be, you know, computer-aided diagnosis or computer-aided, you know, treatment or surgical planning, you know, robotic planning or treatment planning. And some of them can be clinical decision support, and they may or may not be devices. So there's a little bit of a overlap. And some of them may just be practice management, you know, or population health management, or reporting quality measures. So it all depends on how you position it, what the claim is. And what the claim is the collection of all the information that the company is providing to in their marketing. All right. So determining the intended use for, let's say, your digital health innovation, I'll just pick that as an example because it's the most variable of all. So if we look at the increasing clinical impact and increasing regulatory burden, you're supporting wellness and health management. That's kind of low at the scale. Low impact, low burden. If you're looking at medical monitoring or specific clinical metrics, a health condition, a little higher, surveilling, screening, diagnosing, informing a therapy decision, and actually providing therapy digitally. You could see the burden goes up. And now you can overlay this roadmap on top of, you know, the product, the platform, market opportunity, the reimbursement, and you will see that you actually get a landscape out here, okay? And part of the key question that the internship will hopefully you'll get to the answer is, which is the right one? What is the right profile for, you know, the risks that are out there and all the different parameters that you need to look at? Okay, so talking about risk, I just want to throw in a regulatory definition of risk, which is risk to patients, not to be confused with market risk. I like to say the two things the FDA does not care about is your time and your money. So those are not risks by FDA's definition. They talk about risk to health and safety, environment, and property damage, which includes cybersecurity, because that's loss of data privacy is considered property damage. It's a kind of a stretch, but that's how we've shoehorned it in. So the risk classification changes the level of regulation, you know, so that's another sort of overlay on top of things. So there are different regulatory burdens depending on what you have to do for each of the risk classification. Okay. All right. So back to the digital health, there are different regulatory pathways by which you go to market. That's one of your TPP items. That's the output. Remember, we talked about the market opportunity, the IP, and the regulatory pathway. And these are 5 possible regulatory pathways. And then for devices in digital health and possibly biotools. There are a couple of other pathways I didn't include in here to make it too muddy, but you can have a general wellness, you can have a 510K exempt pathway, which is a device that is, and then you have some emergency pathways in special cases in between. You have a 510K, you have gradations of 510K, kind of a low burden 510K, a high burden 510K, a de novo pathway, a PMA, you know. So I know the template just has 510K and PMA, but there are many more different pathways that you can be looking at. There are emergency use pathways, there are unclassified pathways, there are all kinds of nuances in here. So I would really encourage you to do some research here if you have the opportunity to understand the different spaces that the product can operate in. Okay, so as I said earlier, you got to find it, find the right thing, and just wanted to finally share a few resources for you. Here's a link to the FDA databases. I'm just showing the top half. There are many more databases out there. You can look at old 510Ks, you can look at old PMAs, there's summaries, there are adverse event reports, there's all kinds of cool information on this page. So when you go on this page, it's a great place to look at both what products are out there in the market, what are the competitor products that are regulated, that are not regulated, what are the, there's a couple of key ones that you want to look at over here. So maybe another session, Charles, I can provide more input, because I'm aware of the time. So the challenge for TPP is my final slide, is find the key risk drivers and drill down there. So maybe it's your regulatory pathway that's the key risk driver, in which case you want to look at what are the testing. Maybe it's some reimbursement is the key risk driver, like no one's going to pay for it, you know. And so how do you do your health economic value in here? Maybe it's cybersecurity. Maybe, you know, we don't know what the key risk drivers are. So what you need to do is in the TPP, figure out which of these are really important and then focus on them, and which you won't know until you do a little bit of research on all of them. Okay. So with that, I'm gonna, I don't know if there's time for questions, Nate, but I'll let you tell me.
Hey, thanks a lot, Geeta. Yeah, there's a question from Sharika Zutzi. So Sharika, how about you ask your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Hello, Dr. Rao. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was truly very informative. My question was about the unintended, perhaps malicious uses of products.
Right.
Is there anything the FDA does to protect, consumers against that, or is that, something that is dealt with in the later regulatory processes?
Okay, so that's a really, really good question, and it's something that may or may not show up in your TPP analysis. So first of all, the FDA, one of the key risks that you are, the safety and effectiveness risks, and this is a kind of a crossover risk, both safety and effectiveness, is what's called usability risks. And there's an entire FDA guidance on how to manage usability of your product. It mostly applies to devices, digital health, and biotools, but you also, obviously, drugs too, you want to look at it. And in the usability risk, one of the things you must consider is foreseeable misuse. And it's politically incorrect to call it user error. We call it use error because it's the manufacturer's problem to make sure that use error doesn't happen. And you have to foreseeably misuse it. So if you foresee malicious use, which is sometimes called misuse or off-label use or all kinds of other names, then you must warn against it, okay? But you also have to test against it. So a couple of quick corollary. First, identify what they are. Second, warn against it, in your warnings. And third, make sure you do not market it for foreseeable misuse. That is going to be really important. And finally, what's the most challenging is if you become aware of foreseeable misuse, a company must take action right away. So my favorite example of this is when Kim Kardashian tweeted that she took some medication for her pregnancy nausea in her thing. The FDA, because that drug was not indicated for prenatal nausea or pregnancy-related nausea, the FDA clamped down really hard on the company and said, you've got to go ahead and address this question and put out some, social media is included in your labeling. So you do need to make sure that there is, even if the market is out there for something that's off-label use, unless you get your product approved for that off-label use, you can neither market it for it, you've got to be vigilant against it, and you've got to treat it as foreseeable misuse. So long answer, but it's a really good question.
Hey, Geeta, you know what? Thanks so much. That was such a great presentation. And I love the way you, yeah, you had those different axes in terms of, yeah, the two-dimensional renderings of those things were very thought-provoking. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
And, we'll provide Geeta's email address because you might have other questions that arise, in the middle of the night or something. Okay,
yeah, always
so
happy, and I'm available as a mentor. So when we have the mentoring sessions, I'll be happy.
that's cool. Thanks a lot, Geeta.
Okay.
Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce my other friend, Erica Pascal. Erica Pascal's got an interesting career path as well, in that she was an undergrad. She was an undergrad at MIT, studied biology, and then she went to Berkeley and got a PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry with Bob Tejan, did a postdoc at the University of Illinois, and then worked in the pharma industry for, I was going to say years and years and years, but 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. And then she decided, and I know other people that did this, she decided, God, I really am interested in intellectual property. And so she went to law school, became an attorney, and then worked for DLA Piper for 7 or 8 years, up until 5 years ago when she created her own law firm. It was just her and herself, and she for quite a while, but I know now she has employees. But Erica Pascal, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Well, first, let's see. I've had quite the day of bad internet and electronics. So let's hope this gets a little better than what happened with my email today. Which is a story for another day. But anyway, yeah. So I work almost exclusively with startups and almost exclusively in the life sciences biotech area. Every once in a while, there's an exception. And while not everything that comes out of the UCSF Venture Catalyst program is headed to a startup, and we'll talk a little bit about that, there's a lot of commonalities between what I do day to day with clients and what you'll be looking at. So I thought we'd sort of walk through that. I'm going to preface this by saying I have a fair amount of information in this slide deck, and I'm actually not going to cover it all, but I'm going to make this slide deck available to all of you. And if you're looking through it and you or your group think, I'd like to know more about this, or you just don't understand something about it and want to find out, you'll have my email address. And you can reach out, and I'm just going to warn you, to the extent you ever find my phone number, you can call. My ringer's always off. You're going to be just as frustrated as my mom. I don't answer my phone, but I'm really good with email, except for today when it totally crashed. So with that, right? So intellectual property, or IP, right, is basically how do you protect your innovations? And we'll talk about what IP is. But I always like to preface this, particularly with anyone who's in the sciences, that IP should not be the tail that wags the dog. And what I mean by that is some people just get so into, I have to file a patent, I must have a patent, that they kind of forget that they're supposed to be making a product to help people in the healthcare industry, right? And that gets lost around the way. So when you're going through and looking at issues that might have to do with IP in the TPP, you really want to think about, does what we're thinking about really fit the product and the use that makes sense, right? Because otherwise you can go down this little rabbit hole and never come back. All right, so before we get into kind of what IP is, sometimes you want to start out with, what do you want to do with your technology? A lot of the things you'll be looking at came originally from academic research, right? People at the university doing really cool science, and then someone realizing that there was a real world application. Sometimes they start out knowing there's a real world application, sometimes they don't. You want a really good example of that? CRISPR is that. When it was first looked at, it was like, that's a bacterial defense system. It's really cool. No one realized you would be able to do gene editing with it until much later. So when you're sitting with your groups and your ideas, and you want to think about, well, what do you want to do with this technology, right? Or what does the professor want to do? What does the university want to do? Do they want to start a small company? Do they want to just keep it associated with the university and keep working on it? Do you want to license it out, maybe to a big pharma or med device company? There's a lot of different things that could happen, right? Some projects are actually suited for nonprofit organizations and working with them in public health. And each of those has a different strategy about where IP fits in. For things that are particularly startup, but sometimes also for licensing, there's kind of two issues at the early stage that come up. One is preparing for investor diligence, right? So investors invest in startups. You've probably heard of venture capital funds, VCs, maybe you haven't, you can also get grants, whatever. But when someone wants to invest in technology, whether it be an individual or a financial organization, they want to know that the technology has legs, right? There's something there. Otherwise, you can end up in a big mess if you don't do your diligence. A good example would be Theranos, right? Interesting podcast. You ever want to listen to that if you haven't. But for IP diligence, we'll talk about what that means, but that becomes important for these ideas. And the other is, how are you protecting the ideas? Are you building what I call your castle and your moat, basically using intellectual property so that you can keep others from being a copycat to your idea? So basically what IP strategy is, and what I spend most of my days doing with startups, is protection and a clear path to market. In other words, what can you protect and how and when you're going to do that? And we'll touch on that. And what else is out there, right? So we'll talk about third parties, meaning other companies, universities, people can own IP that actually will prevent you from bringing your product to market, right? And you might need to figure that out. And so those are the two biggie details that, tend to come up early on with these ideas. Okay, we're going to talk about two kinds of intellectual property. There are many flavors, right? So if I went through the list, right, it would be patents and trade secrets. Those are the main ones that kind of play in the biotech and life sciences area. But there's also copyright and trademark, for example, that we're not going to talk about today, but in certain industries and even in areas of life sciences can be really big. It's just unlikely at this stage it's going to come up with you. So first, we're going to kind of hit up patents and dispel a quick urban legend. So you may or may not have ever come in contact with patents, but it is not uncommon for me to hear that, hey, I've got a patent, so I've got freedom to operate. I can bring my product to market because I have the patent on it. And unfortunately, that's just a big urban legend. Why? Because patents are like fences, right? Think about putting a fence around your property. They keep other people out. But just because you put a fence on your property doesn't actually mean that you own that property. You may think you own it, but there could be, for example, your neighbor may actually own part of that property and your fence is on it. That happens to a lot of people, actually. Happened to me. So we'll just keep that in mind. But what the purpose of having a patent is to keep others from copying, right? From coming onto your property. So first thing is, what can you patent, right? This is a big question for everyone. So this is what I call the egg diagram, and you can make this for pretty much any type of technology. I chose therapeutics here. We'll look at it a little bit for device too, right? So therapeutics, like your active ingredient. What is the drug? What if your drug could be an antibody or a small molecule? You could protect that. Sometimes that stuff is already known. You could protect the formulation, right? That's what they mix the drug with. So it, for example, penetrates the skin or is readily available in the blood system or doesn't, dissolve until it gets through your stomach acid. Then you have methods of making the drug, right? That's like your chemical synthesis, or if you're a biologic, you're making it in cells. Methods of use, which is like methods of treatment, right? Treating patients, what indications, when do you give it? How often do you give it? And then you get into combinations of drugs and device, combination of drugs with other drugs, combinations with drugs and diagnostics, right? So you could make the same diagram for example, medical device. Instead of active ingredients, you'd have your various components, right? If you worked on, I don't know, let's say, some kind of medical scanner, right? You might have various parts of the scanner and the software that are down here. You wouldn't have formulations, but you would have like methods of making. You might have formulations, might instead be combinations of components that give you systems. Methods of use and the specific indications would be similar. And we could do the same thing with diagnostics, but then we'd be here all day and then we'd get to like digital health. I'm going to tell you that software and digital health is a bit of an exception and an outlier. It's not that you can't patent it, but a lot of what goes on in software moves at a very different rate in terms of iterations, right? And how often it changes. And it's often something that the consumer sees what comes out the other end, but not the actual software. And so it gets protected a little differently. I'm not going to talk about that, but if anyone ever wants to have a chat, it's kind of interesting. All right, another big question people always ask me, okay, how long is it going to take to get the patent, right? How long are we going to be here? And I always tell people a really long time, right? And why? Because patents, there are reasons for the delay, but it's a long process. So you have a good idea, you do some data in the lab, it all looks good. You file what's called a provisional application, and UCSF does this all the time. And then you have 12 months to add data and update it before it's kind of locked in place, right? So that's great. And your projects may be at that stage. They may have just filed a provisional or they're gonna, and then they're gonna develop that out. And then that thing that becomes what we call PCT or Patent Cooperation Treaty application. Don't worry about what that is right now, but it becomes like a real patent application. And it publishes in 18 months, right? That means the whole world gets to see what you put in that application. And then 12 months after that, at 130, you go into different countries, right? Because a patent is specific for each country. And then it could take another 1 to 5 or even more years to actually get granted patents, right? So it is very rare that when you're at the early startup stage that you have granted patents. You're often looking at what published as an application at that point. And I'll come back to that, but keep that in mind. All right, we are not going through this slide. It's high level. At some point, if anyone's really interested, I am glad to take you through it. But patents, to get a patent, it's quite a hurdle, right? It has to be new. It has to be non-obvious. You have to fully describe it. You have to teach people how to actually do it. You can't hide the ball. And then there are some things that are just not patentable. For example, natural products. I cannot take a bacteria out of soil and just patent the bacteria anymore. In Europe, you cannot patent methods of actually treating humans. There are ways of getting around that to get the same sort of protection, but interesting sort of odd bits of IP. But the reason this will become important if you work with your group is one of the things in diligence that gets asked is your idea novel, or have you or someone else already published it? That's a most common question. Okay, I don't know how many of your groups are going to get and look for, right, what's in the landscape. And what I mean by that is, say I have a really good idea for a medical device and you want to know, hey, anyone ever made this device before? You might go into the research literature, right, and look around and not see anything. You might Google and see that, for example, no one sold a device like that, or not too close, right? Yours is different. But then you want to know, has anyone filed a patent application, right? Because industry, right, let's take a group like Medtronic, they don't publish a lot, or a drug company like Pfizer. They tend to publish the stuff that doesn't work, and all the stuff that's working really well, they keep trade secret, right? They keep to themselves until they get on the market. And so the only place you see those things are in patent applications. For anyone who's curious, there are some public databases from the US Patent Office and what's called WIPO, W-I-P-O. If you want those websites and you want to learn how to search them just to get an idea of what's out there, happy to sit down with you and show you how to do it. I do searching myself. I use a proprietary database. Unfortunately, I can't give you access to that because it's like $3,000 a pop, and there's a lot of you on this call, and I don't have that much money. So yeah, too bad, out of luck. But what I do want you to know is patents, right? If you go to the back of a patent, right, you're going to see a bunch of numbered words that usually says what is claimed, and then there's a bunch of numbers, right? Those are the claims. That is either in an application what someone wants the patent to cover, right, in terms of this is my picket fence around my yard, or it's, if it's a granted patent, it's literally what the patent covers, right? In terms of like, who owns this, right? Can I do this? So like in this claim, for example, they have a claim that's to a particular method of doing CRISPR. If this were an issued patent and you wanted to do that CRISPR method, you'd either need to own this patent or have a license to it. Otherwise, they could sue you for patent infringement. Anyway, so it's the part of the patent that you usually look at first. But what I want to warn people is that, remember I told you patent applications publish, right? So when you go doing your searches, like on the Patent Trademark Office, remember you're going to see published applications. So published applications here on the left, they're published, meaning they're available. You can read them, you can look at them. We won't talk about what prior art means, but at some later point, if someone wants to know, we'll get to that. Note that the claims are kind of like your Christmas list. They're what you wish the patent will cover, or what you wish you get granted, but they're not enforceable at this time. They're just a wish list. And they often change when they go from patent application to granted patent, because the patent office will actually explain to you why your invention may not be novel or may be very similar to something else. So you make little tweaks to differentiate it. On the flip side, granted patents, they're published and they are enforceable, right? As long as there are exceptions to that, but generally, let's just take that today. And how do you tell, right? Because I cannot tell you how many times people call me up in a total panic, not interns, but my own clients, companies like, oh my gosh, my biggest competitor has a patent and now I can't do this. And what they really have is a patent application, which they should keep an eye on. But again, remember, it's that Christmas list thing. And as we all know, at least when I was a kid, what I hoped to get, for holiday presents, sometimes you wanted the bicycle and instead you got like a globe. I don't think they even make globes anymore, that show the whole world. Sorry, disappointment from childhood, but that's kind of how patents work too. So the way you tell is in the US, it's on the upper right, it says pub number for publication number, whereas on the issued patent, right, it's on the right-hand side, patent number. PCTs, which are published worldwide applications, have WO numbers. They only issue in individual countries, like EP over here, and they always have the letter B after them, or generally do. So it's kind of a guide, to see. The database will also tell you if it's granted or not. You can look at this on Google Patents too. I'm just not a big fan of that site. All right. So that's all I'm going to say about patents. Like I said, happy to give you, get down into the details and talk about searches. But the other thing I think that it's truly important for this project, and Charles touched on it earlier from your perspective with confidentiality, which is just as important from a startup perspective as a small company or even a project that's thinking about a company. And this is why. In order to be novel, right, and to keep patent protection, you can't tell the world before you file your patent application, or you can lose your patent rights, right? You want to file first, then you can decide to blab. And then more importantly, right, we talked about a different type of IP just briefly called trade secret. So trade secret is like when you have really important knowledge, right? And by important, it means it has a value to it, right? So let's talk about what would that mean? Well, it's if we looked at, if I had an idea for example, how to make a drug, how to synthesize it, I don't want anyone to know, that would be a trade secret. On the other hand, you probably sitting here today can't probably guess from looking at me what type of shampoo I used this morning. That's a secret, not really a trade secret. I don't think it has any value, at least for me. Now, if I were like some famous movie star, maybe that would be different, but we'll keep it at that. So a lot of things in biotech are trade secrets and are never patented. So good examples: fermentation methods, cell lines, methods of growing cell lines, a lot of chemical synthesis in terms of scale up and manufacturing. Algorithms for diagnostics often are kept as trade secret. A lot of algorithms behind software, all kinds of digital, whether it's digital medicine or just anything that's sort of a software platform, often runs on it sort of by trade secret. There is no filing for trade secret. It's basically you have to keep a secret, right? And there are procedures you can do in your company, like confidentiality agreements, that are very important. But it is, because that runs very importantly, one of the reasons Charles is telling you you need to keep things confidential is if, let's say, someone had something really important that you, even accidentally, let's say you got on Caltrain, right, started talking really loudly on your cell phone, and it turned out a competitor was sitting right behind you. You would have two problems, right? If it was a big secret, you would have let the competitor in on this, right? And they could go and use it, right? Because they just heard it on a public train. The other thing is, what happens if you accidentally put something on your social media account? Now it's published. When someone does a search for, including the PTO, right, the Patent and Trademark Office, for was anything published, it doesn't have to be published in a journal. I mean, it could be on a website, it could be on LinkedIn, it could be on Snapchat, doesn't matter, whatever they can search. So it's very important to understand what you can disclose, right, as a project or as a company, when you want a confidentiality agreement, right? So say you have a really hot medical device, you want to go talk to Medtronic. Well, you want to have a confidentiality agreement in place, because if you don't, right, Medtronic say, oh, thanks, you're giving it to me for free. And they take the idea, not that there's anything unethical, right? If they think you are actually just kind of giving away your ideas, there's nothing, to say that they couldn't use them. And so you want to set those boundaries. And a big thing for startups and even, projects that are looking for funding is you're going to go out and give a pitch, right? You might go to a pitch competition, you might go in front of potential investors, and you need to decide how much detail you're going to give. Are you going to give a non-confidential, where what I say is this: how do you know what's confidential? If it's something you wouldn't want your competitor to know, then it's confidential, right? So just don't go there. What I say about companies when we're a startup and people say, well, what can I put on my LinkedIn account? You can put on anything that's on the company website, right? That type of information. If you go beyond that, then you're likely going to hit a trouble spot. For projects like this, you might ask, the professor may have published something already, and then there may be parts that are non-confidential because they're already out there in the public. But if they're not, keep that in mind. All right, like I said, lots of disclosures to keep in mind, right, for things that affect both trade secret and your patent rights. Big ones for university research articles. Professors love to publish. They should publish. That's what they're supposed to do, as well as students and postdocs. But if you publish something, it's not a trade secret. And if you publish before you file your patent application, while there are some exceptions, it does lead to problems. Student thesis, whether anything that's, again, those are all put online, or almost all, by universities. Websites and posters and social media is a big one. But another big one for therapeutics is clinicaltrials.gov, right? So when someone goes to do a clinical trial, right, you post what the clinical trial is, so healthcare providers and patients can find it, but that actually gives away a lot of information. I'm not going to go through all these. Just keep in mind there's a lot of ways you can tell people, and sometimes it's unintentional. All right. I don't know that we have time for questions, because I know Charles is really big on getting you in your groups. But I will include this information. Like I said, the phone number is kind of useless because the ringer's off. But the email,
Erica, how about if you take a couple of quick questions?
Yep.
Shakira again, oh, I had it and I just lost it, sorry. Asked about, actually, Shakira, let me just paraphrase this, is that if you make a minor design change and you get a patent for it, how the heck can companies protect their overall IP from other people that are just making minor changes to your product?
Good question. So remember I had that picture of the castle and the moat, right? So the castle is, think of it like this is exactly what I built, right? Or I made. And the moat is all the variations you can think of that if you put on a competitor hat, you would have made if you couldn't make the castle, right? And then you put all those in your patent application, and you can even claim some of them if they're close enough. So yeah, that's one way that you can, sort of prevent close copycats.
Got it. Thanks.
And I'm not going to talk about today, but I really, there is, interestingly, if Geeta and I were to get together, there's a very interesting interplay between regulatory and IP, where you can use both to sort of block someone, right? So that you get exclusivity on both sides. Again, topic for another day, but definitely interesting.
Can you clarify quickly for Daniel Cavallo or Oliveira that if you just file in the United States, you do not get international patent protection, correct?
No, that's correct. When you get a patent, it's specific for each country. So, if you want a patent, for example, in Argentina, you got to file in Argentina. If you want a patent in Australia, so on and so forth.
I'm not sure about this one, but Christopher Zhu says, what does Erica think about using confidentiality agreements if you're going to talk to a venture capitalist?
Yeah, so I do that all the time. There's an urban legend that VCs don't sign confidentiality agreements, and that's actually not true. They just don't sign them at super early stages. So if they're doing what I call the drive-by, right? They're just taking a little look-see. They kind of want to know what you work on. They're not going to sign something. When they're doing true diligence, like they're going to see like what your details of your science really are, as well as all your IP and things that you've never published, they'll sign a confidentiality agreement.
Right.
And I do a lot of those for startups.
And then Saisri Akandi asks, can you just mention a little bit about design patents in the context of
Sure.
medical devices?
Yeah, design patents, which aren't just for medical devices. They could be, for example, for a user interface, for software, many different things. But what they are is they're different than normal patents because they're not focused on what the thing does. They're literally focused on what the thing looks like. So for example, in ultrasonic surgical devices, right, which, I actually used to work in this area from litigation with Medtronic and Ethicon, which is a J&J company. The curve of the handle, right, is very distinctive, not just for its functionality, but to show which manufacturer made the device, right, in terms of where they put the buttons. So the way those patents work is you actually draw out your thing, right, in diagrams. There are no words in the patent. It's just diagrams. And infringement is based on somewhat like consumer confusion a type of that. In other words, would the consumer is it distinctive? Would the consumer recognize it? And if someone made something similar, would they get confused? Would it look like the picture in the patent?
Got it, thanks. And then Ofer, I want Ofer to ask his question because Erica talked a lot about patents versus trade secrets. So Ofer, if you didn't clarify your question, go for it right now.
Oh, it's clear enough. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. And so, hey, Erica, that was great. It was really great. I'm looking at the clock. We got 10 minutes until 12:30. And so, Nate, I'm going to turn it over to you to distribute us to our 15 breakout rooms. Thanks.
And just so you know, I'm putting my email in the chat for anyone
Thank you
who
very much,
didn't get it.
Erica.
Great. Thank you very much, Charles. Erica, Geeta, also, thank you very much for your presentations. All right, so what we're going to do